Ludwig Klages on Ancestor Veneration. Contemporary ethnographers tend to say that the primeval cult of souls stems from a fear of ghosts, and they draw on this to explain why the cult had to disappear as the belief in ghosts dwindled more and more in the light of reason. However, the fear-based customs of serving the dead indubitably stand alongside erotic traditions, and the more we uncover its oldest lair, the more they stand radiantly to the fore. We still know the garland, Kranz, as the crown, Kron, where, in the German, the former takes its name from the latter, and to crown somebody means even for us to bestow on them the highest order or right. Garland, Kranz, equals crown, Kron, is the primal symbol of apotheosis, the teleti, perfection achieved. Each crown is the crown of life, or symbol of the gamos of the life poles, the completed marriage of a crowned soul with the soul of the all. This is why the garland or the band adorns the mysties, and for the same reason the victor, the monarch, the priest, and also the bride. But we also know that the Mycenaeans bedecked their dead with garland and band. The dead had for them achieved the highest order. The deceased had become a mystes, hero, even daimon, and the act of dying coincided with the apotheosis of the consummating gamos, esteemed as tritopatores, and in turn as beings that bestowed blessings. The ancestral ghosts are present at every wedding. Offerings of drinks are made to them, and the corporal wedding of the bride couple is placed in the protection of their consecrating power. Romulus, the ancestor of the Roman Empire who became a god, was the protector of infants and made weak children healthy. Equally, during the Christian period, Saints Cosmas and Damian, after their death, took on the office of blessing and healing children as two ancestral ghosts and inheritors of Asclepius. Could there be any more powerful evidence that the source of ministering to the dead was Eros, and that the faith underlying it was the inner certainty of their ever-present closeness? Or furthermore, we still recognize the color purple as the symbol of the highest majesty. We shall not go into the source of the symbolism of purple here, but instead we refer to the fact that the Mycenaeans loved to wrap their dead in purple cloths, and bedded them to their final rest on olive, myrtle, and poplar leaves. To list the evidence depicting similar things among primitive peoples would require volumes. Among the northern Indian tribes, ghosts of the ancestors gave luck when hunting. In Tanna, the souls of the chiefs became gods of the fruit trees. In Tonga and New Zealand, they became gods of battle. The fear-based traditions are only a later, lateral manifestation of the sympathetic traditions to be found spread across the whole of the Pelasgian world. Nothing preoccupied the people of the Pelasgian stage more than the ceremony of burials and the care of the corpse. The most humanly poignant tragedy of all antiquity celebrates the self-sacrifice of Antigone in the service of holy rites for the body of her fallen brother, an unparalleled motif if we measure it against contemporary poetry. Primordial burials most probably took place in the house, under the stove, or in the middle of the village, before the walls and the city gate, on the market, in the Prytaneum, and on the festival grounds. And so at Olympia the graves of Pelops was located next to the great ash altar of Zeus, and the temples were simultaneously tombs of a daemon. An example, the Delphic temple of Apollo over the tomb of the great earth god Python. In earlier times, Christianity also buried the dead of noble lineages in cathedrals and priories, and even today it gathers its village graves in the shelter of churches. The most prodigious structures of the Egyptians, the pyramids, are burial tombs, likewise the rock temples of the Lycians and Rome's catacombs. Diodorus tells us of the Egyptians. Greater care is taken with the dwelling places of the dead than with those of the living. The latter they view as shelter for a short, transitory period, whereas the graves alone are the true and permanent abodes for eternity. The sites of the dead were no less the holy groves, the hollowed mountains of many peoples, the Manitou stones of the Indians, the pagodas of the Chinese, and the Hindu stupas. The soul of the dead flutters and hovers around the tomb, housed there in the form of a snake. Residing there is the genius loci, bestowing blessings on the house of the living as an agathodaimon. The entire Roman cult originates in the worship of domestic ancestral spirits, the Lares, similarly with Japanese Shintoism. The tribes of antiquity, and likewise all wild peoples, named and name themselves happily after a mythic primal ancestor. In order to honor the death of a celebrated hero of the past, there arose the Greek aegon, symbolizing the circle of coming into being and passing away. Who could deny that this is not about fearing or repelling ghosts, but about those living in the present, lovingly venerating the dead? Living beings petition for the requited love of elevated beings from the past, drawing them into life again and again with customs and rites, some of which are immediately understandable and some of which pertain to a mystical significance. Finally, what could assure us more irrefutably of this than the Lacrimo's late Greek custom of having the heroic dead appear on terracotta grave pieces in the form of Eros himself, sometimes sleeping with a lowered torch, sometimes as if lightly lethargic from the feast of life, in light, garlanded, and leaning on a lounge bed with a cup left over from a bout of drinking. But this did not lead to the dead of prehistory gaining immortality. Rather, it was as if they had not died at all, but were present, yet transformed. Only the intellectual method of perception that saw death as an annihilation of existence yielded a previously incomprehensible dread of death, and with that the passionate desire for immortality. In contrast, primal man, for whom the sheer existent world still hid itself in shadows, behind the soul world of living images, knew neither this dread nor this desire. He was as yet not enough of a person as to have the notion of existence. Suppress him and determine his traditions and rites, as is the case with today's humanity. As certain as everything, whether it be thing or human, for him merely exists alongside each other, so assuredly it was not only man that lived for him, but also the so-called dead thing, even the matter from which it is formed. A word that we cannot forget stems from mater, mother, symbol of the primal source. Admittedly, dying was also a momentous event for primal man, but it was not the annihilation of existence, but life metamorphosis. In those days, one did not die as we would mean it, because there was not yet anything intrinsically dead as we would understand it. In order to understand the connection between the visionary state and the state of immortalizing life, one must first take great pains to think oneself into the unbridgeable abyss that separates the perception of death in prehistoric times from the perception of death in the present. Hence why we will illustrate this subsequently in light of the primeval world. Every genuine adherent to the intellectual religion of Christianity believes in a personal immortality of the soul. However, if a farmer came from the parish to a Protestant or Catholic priest to tell him that the grave of his grandfather is haunted and that his grandfather's soul is in fact walking around that place, the carer of souls, which is that priest, would instruct him that his grandfather's soul is in the afterlife or in heaven, and could therefore not possibly be found walking around anywhere. In such a way, the belief in immortality banishes souls from the world and turns powerful souls into pitiful souls, debasing the entirely opposing beliefs in souls by turning them into mere superstitions. Catholicism retains remnants of an ancient form of ministering to the dead in the last rites and in the reading of the Mass and All Souls' Day. For the Protestant, those consummate Christians, it is a matter of dust to dust and spirit to spirit, while the soul loses both the here and the there, and ultimately it loses the last inch of its home. Neither to be found on earth, nor on any of the countless stars, the soul does not dwell at all in space, but in a place of not here, at a place beyond heaven in the afterlife. And so, that which stood at the center of the ministering to souls in the primeval world consequently becomes an arbitrary thing of wimpish piety. The care of the corpse, of the grave, and of the ashes. The art and culture of the primeval world thrive in the soil of the grave cult, because they know no immortality of the soul, but instead they recognize their enduring presence. All of Christianity, believing as it does in immortality, sees the body as merely a cadaver. The grave is just a place that one plows over after 30 to 40 years to make it good for use again. In the once living ancestor, they see an entirely impotent being that does not in any way intervene in the interests of the living. To relocate the soul to the afterlife as immortal means to rob it of its earthly home and turn it into a departed and therefore nullified soul. It was certainly not the Christian in him, but the pagan mysties that seized the pen of the poet to write these verses. We dead men are greater in number than you on the earth, than you on the waters. With forbearing deeds the fields we have plowed. Your sickles you swing and cut what we sowed, and what you achieve and what we began still pours into gurgling springs on your land. And all of our loves and hates and our pains still beat way up there in your mortal veins. And by the laws that we have established are your earthly affairs yet still directed. And our music, our art, and our poetry are lauded with laurels in the light of mortality. Still we pursue the goals of humanity. Thus honor and sacrifice, for we are many. That African chief, says exemplary ethnographer Lippert, who removed himself from the company of a traveler because his headache reminded him that he had been neglectful in caring for the soul of his father, expresses the perception of an entire primal time. The fact is true, but unfortunately, our researcher fails to interpret it. He is occupied with nothing more than the circumstance that this chief fears the spirit of his father. However, we ask, how could his thought, all of a sudden, jump from a pain in his head to a non-present ancestral soul? Would it have not been more obvious to think of the rays of the equatorial sun that probably burned down on his crown, and to see the cause of his headache in that? Indeed, would not our chief have acted rather in this way as a sensory being with a belief in the present that he certainly was? There is no doubt that mere thoughts can indeed define a European of the modern era, but absolutely not a sensual Negro. Nevertheless, if he has bypassed the sensual present and sought the source of his pain in the ancestral spirit, this implies that his forefathers' overwhelming presence has become distinctly more tangible to him than even the scorching rays of the sun. It was not the memory of a venerable ancestral soul, but its phantasma that seized his mind and being. His animalistic fear and his primitive will of perception require no explanation. The rationally inaccessible of his interpretation, however, illustrates irrefutably that he is connected in a awake state with the reality of dream-like images. The person who in principle denies a phantasma as claim to reality can also not avoid admitting this. Mythologists who derive all of prehistory's beliefs about souls from dreams nevertheless are a little closer to the truth than those who take the view that their origin derives from the perception of dying. For we, who are not poets, can of course only attempt to reflect on this by contemplating our dreams, that souls were just as sensually present for primal man as perceptual things are for us. However, we would err again if we attempted to understand the state of primal consciousness by assuming more intense and prolific dreams and a more animated contemplation thereof. It has not so much to do with nightly dreams as with the fact that the waking state of prehistoric man can rather be compared with our dreaming than our waking state, and yet it does not in any way overlap with the state of sleeping. We have repeatedly expressed that visions transform the visionary. This obviously denotes an extreme contrast to the act of perceiving, which elevates the person doing the perceiving from the thing being perceived and actually only then affirms his limited being for itself. We will now share a few sentences from a fragment of our work on dream consciousness, which appeared decades ago. These lines undertake to convey the essential characteristic of images, namely their transmutability, by way of the standard dream experience. These are capable of carrying us unawares into the visionary's reality consciousness, which alienates the man of rational wakefulness into a state of bewilderment. The assumption was that there are also dream moods in a waking state, and that an indicator of these dispositions is the feeling of fleetingness in the person experiencing them. Thus, following on from the third point, the wrenching fleetingness of reality for the man in a dreamy mood, we encounter a trait of the dream that was underlined by all observers, as it seems to us, but was not taken by any of them to the end point, which is the indefatigable mutability of all dream imagery. The road on which I was just traveling in my dream has in the next moment transformed into a canal, the carriage into a ship. The house walls have also just retreated, and I am sailing between many ships in a port. At the same time, I am not astonished and have no feelings of lack regarding the coherency of the sequence of events. If we derived the preference of mythical thinking for nebulously vivid atmospheres from the fleetingness of dream reality, then we would find the reason for this atmospheric moment in the capacity of each dream manifestation to transform itself into any other thing. And for the myth, we find the motif of its selection in the compulsion to know the gods, daemons, fairies, elves, and other spectral beings to be equipped with the self-same talent. They all share this in common, both the exchanging of the shape itself and also the transformation of an enemy or friend, things, animals, or people. Ovid captured by happy chance the core of the full nature of myths and fables when he chose the stopping places for his poetic journey from the angle of metamorphoses, although he did not manage to convey the fundamental phenomenon in the language of literature. We comprehend at least one element of what causes the dreamer's feeling of transience in his experience of the dream as he suddenly believes himself to be transformed. This supports our hypothesis of this relationship between the dream occurrence and the soul in particular. For whatever the lords of the dream, the gods, are able to do, exactly that must be able to occur happily or unhappily to the dreaming soul, to fan out into the multiplicity of things, and internally to become one with stones, plants, animals, people, and objects, particularly as a consequence of this dream-thinking logic, which in many places has been condensed into the dogma of the transmigration of the soul. The dream-bound spirit does not fundamentally know any inanimate or merely mechanical thing. Animals, plants, and dead things speak to him. He shares at every moment in the fate of the world surrounding him, and in turn, we tend compulsively to choose the tangibly mutable, which determines the typical shapes of the soul, the swirling breath, the flickering light and the lambent flame, the water of springs and rivers from which murmur auguring voices, the glimmering sun dust particles, amongst animals, those that escape silently or on wings, and particularly the bird, the fish, and the snake, the fluttering butterfly, the migrant bee, the hunting wolf, the agile weasel, the hurrying mouse that so often runs out of the mouth of the sleeper when the soul begins its wandering. To bring the principle of transformation, and along with it the souls, into the power of the day-awake spirit is the ancient goal of all theurgists, exorcists, and necromancers. It is also one of the pro-ethnic roots of mysticism, the primal form of which, unsullied by any intellectualizing swindle, can be conceived of in the light of, for example, the self-transformation of Germanic heroes into werewolves and berserkers, the devil dancers of Ceylon into demons, the ancient Thracian Sabos Mystes into the rapturous Thiassos of the frantic bull god. Greek myth, amongst others, envisioned it in the form of a god and of course of a water demon, specifically that seal-friendly old man of the sea Proteus, who it says in the Odyssey was seized by Menelaus and his fur-clad compatriots, upon which he transformed himself into a lion, and when they still would not let go, he transformed himself one after the other into a leopard, dragon, boar, flowering water, and a sky-scraping tree before he was defeated and gave up his infallible precognizance of the future. subsequently taking him as a classic daemon of the mythical art of transformation, we justifiably attribute the reality of the dream with a protean character. If in the above we compared the waking state of the visionary man to our dream state, then those preceding sentences allow us to guess something of the immense change in perception that his entire outlook on life, his belief in what is true, his thinking and actions have undergone as a result. It can hardly be compared with what we understand by believing, that is, a belief in tangible facts. If e.g. the Vedic hymns thinks, without any sense of contradiction, that the fire daimon Agni originated from heaven, from the water, in the woods, in stone, in plants, through the gamos of rubbing wood together, in the womb of butter. In turn, however, like the Promethean fire, he can be fetched down from the heights by a primeval hero, and if he is at times called a bull, a light red horse, at times the shining tongue of the gods, or the mouth with which they consume the fire offerings, we are tempted to consider it nothing more than the wild nature poetry, when the storm gods, the Maruts, race along chattering, milking the heavens' udders, and filling the earth with milk, blowing the storm pipe, plundering the sea of clouds like the caterpillar does the tree, bending the woods like elephants, and approaching with a lion's roar that makes the earth roll like a ship. However, we have already considered what is involved with genuine poetry. In the meantime, we should not forget that all spirit beings, not only praised but also venerated with abundant sacrifices, appeased and attracted by ritual that encompasses all of human life, with ceremonies and obligations, and that the meaning of the images that appear to be only decorative, but which in truth are unfolding, predominantly reoccurs in extensive magical customs and rites, all of which would obviously be meaningless without a belief in their reality. It would be futile to attempt to understand the undulations of dream meaning from the perspective of waking consciousness, where one's own contemplation of it can congeal into an event that dissipates into sonorous images. Even in fairy tales, the childlike brother of visionary life, whether originating in India or Arabia, Oceania or Germany, the event is thoroughly transported from the physical space of that wakefulness, which is idiosyncratic to us, by the momentum secretly inherent to all objects and beings to exchange forms with rapidity. And so, accordingly, brittle leaves become joyous gold, the ugly frog becomes a handsome prince, and the murdered man is wondrously reborn from bones that have shed their flesh. The Indian would never have called his totem animal, the wolf, for example, the first man, if he was not capable of experiencing, had he not actually experienced through ecstatic visions that a wolf had transformed into a man, or a man had transformed into a wolf. The nerve center of all visionary thinking is the experiential certainty of the transformability of the phenomenal world. However, the word transformation also includes dying. And if we follow the dream logic of the primal condition to its ultimate conclusion, it would not be difficult for us to determine what role the dead play in relation to the living. And whoever has been blessed by ecstatic visions to move out into the untouchable distance, he will come back to himself and subsequently experience the eternal here-ness of the untouchable body as a manacle to the soul. His soul, which had flown away like a bird, has been fetched back by invisible threads to the place where he is chained down and into a restricted closeness. If his soul tore those threads, then instead of temporarily restricted freedom and revocable transformation, it would partake in the fate of unshackled wandering and an unrestricted capacity for transformation, all of which is nevertheless deeply problematic, because such a fate promises cosmic fulfillment of life as much as it threatens to lead astray onto a random odyssey into untrodden territories. But in death, they really do tear, as there is no doubt then the soul leaves the body, abandoned to the infinite possibility of transfiguration in the allness of space. This is the predominant basis for its daimonic power. However, as we shall see, alongside such power arises the risk of it being alienated and of it losing itself, drawing on a phrase used by the philosopher Plotinus about matter as the location of images. We can say the soul of the person living in the present is an image bound to matter, and the soul of the dead person is an image released from matter. Turned completely into an image, the soul now has the real and true form of a dream manifestation. It transforms itself, comes and goes, unrestricted by material limits. After all, who appears as a vengeful ghost to the wicked Don Juan, the statue of the murdered governor? Even there we can perceive the echo of a belief from an entire primeval world. In the immortal words of the eloquent Pindar, the body follows death. The all-powerful, the likeness of the living person, however, remains alive. But it sleeps, this eidolon, when the limbs are active, but in dreams it often shows the sleeper the future. That is the key to the service of the souls. That vengeful statue was not the only one in antiquity. And so we are told that the statue of Theogenes, that had been scourged by a presumptuous and scornful man, waited for his moment until the wicked man passed by, and when it fell over, it killed him. Far away from being wrenched from the world, immersed in the invisibility of the afterlife, the deceased soul is rather a daimonic living image, sometimes of a star, a stone, a tree, or animal, sometimes of a spring, a river, a caressing breath of air, then again the likeness of its previously incarnate body. The prehistorical belief is not that there are invisible souls or that there is even a personal existence beyond death. Instead, it holds true that the images of things are alive, and as it becomes an image, and nothing more than an image, so it lives all the more free of shackles, and has all the more taken on the character of the magically metamorphic soul. In passing, we remember that not just the Greeks and the Romans used the word shadow and also eidolon to be synonymous with soul, but also innumerable wild peoples still do so today, such as the now extinct Tasmanians and the Algonquin Indians, the Quiche, Arawaks, Abipones, Zulus, Basutos, Greenlanders, etc. The manifold magic of the mirror, the conjuring and prophesying arts, using reflective surfaces, the global use of black magic worked, with objects conceived in the likeness of its focus. The doctrine of signatures, astrology, all of this is only comprehensible through the ancient equivalency of the essence of soul and image. The Makushi Indians of Guyana say that after the decay of the body, there remains the man in our eyes. The Fiji Islanders differentiate between the dark spirit and the light spirit. The former is the shadow of the person, the latter is his image in water. According to European folklore, a sick person was bewitched or doomed if the image in his pupils disappeared. Likewise, whoever lost his shadow fell foul of the subterranean powers, as only the dematerialized soul images are shadowless. And now let us reflect on what the temples were originally. They were not devotional spaces for the community as with the Christian cathedrals. Instead, they were the houses of the gods, and accordingly were such places where revering believers were capable of seeing the gods and really did behold them at the sight of their idols. The nature of daimonic forces was for the pagan so much the same as the ability to appear that the preferred definition of theon, the godly, derives from thetan, the visible. For this reason, he called Jews and Christians atheoi, despisers of the gods, and rightly so, as they had elevated the spirit to a gods negating God, the invisible principle of image-hating will. Early Christianity knew precisely about this, as shines forth from The City of God by Augustine, who details the opinions that they held in regard to that legendary holder of Egyptian wisdom and magic, namely Hermes Trismegistus. He was thought to have known and taught how to invite the spirits of the gods to inhabit visible and tangible images, that the sensual spirit-filled predicted the future and pronounced through lots, through the priests, through dreams, and many other ways. Even more revealing is the outrage of Minucius Felix in Octavius. Thus are the demons, as shown by magicians, philosophers, and by Plato, housed in statues or images, by means of rites, and they receive through inspiration the power equivalent to a present and immediate divinity, whereby they at times enthuse priests, inhabit temples, animate the filaments of intestines, direct the flight of birds, guide the fall of the lots, and issue oracles. And these are the madmen that you see in public places, and even the priests are made crazy by them outside of the temple, rushing and turning about in circles. However, that which applies to the soul of the gods applies to a lesser degree to the closer souls of departed friends and relatives, for the gods are themselves only souls of our forefathers. Naturally, from another circle of humanity, and thanks to the nature of visions, the gods radiate over the present from an increasingly stellar height the further away the distance of past from where they shine appears to be. In his Remains of Arabian Paganism, Wellhausen reports from the Orient that the people there produced images of several deceased people, so that each person could visit his brother, cousin, or father in the subsequent generation. Veneration of the images increased further by the third generation they worshipped them. According to the Chinese, their god of war was the spirit of a former great warrior, the god of art, an inventor of tools, and the god of pigs, an outstanding swineherd. Until recently, the Chinese emperor made a sacrificial offering twice a year to the spirit of Confucius, who was perceived as a powerful deity. In the words of Augustine, who reflects the sentiments of many others, we already find an all too understandable doubt, which has become condensed more recently for ethnography into an as yet unsolved problem of whether the statue, idol, or fetish is itself a daemonic being or only its domicile. In reality, they are both at the same time. As a touchable body, it is the domicile of the soul, and as solely visible images the soul itself. The images flashing up in the visionary experience come and go, transform themselves, never let themselves be seized or held, and the place that can be physically touched is in relation to them at best their shrine. They can be present there without anyone necessarily noticing them. Not everyone recognizes the secret signs of their presence, and only the one transported in ecstasy receives their afflatus that overflows with a rippling shiver. But when sacrificial piety soaks in blood the localized emblem with bewitching essences, then it was revealed to the descending soul, which momentarily transformed the image, redeeming it in the appearance of the god. As indicated above, there is a risk of the roaming soul roving from one place to another, from one transformation to another, finally it being deactualized through losing the capacity for embodiment. Amongst the Icelanders, the departure of souls is called passage of apparitions. They may indeed have won as a home the space that stretches over cosmic distances, but they have lost a home of place, of closeness that merges both in intimacy and warmth. Space and place, distance and closeness belong to each other as polarities, as do heaven and earth, migration and remaining periphery and central point. Separated from the turn of the firmament, the tellurgic withers, unanchored from the core of the earth, the sidereal evaporates. If the former requires images of the past for the veil of its inseminating storm, then the reverential fervor addressed to the dream daemonic souls of our forebears, and the willingness to give sacrifices by those physically present in the light safeguard against dissipation in the nightly abysms of space. This is why, to use a metaphor, those who once existed now thirst like parched wanderers for a lush and fertile place, and for places kept holy. And the living, for their part, ignited by Eros of distance, make ready for them, and seal with conjuring signs, grave or temple, grove or column, tree or stone pyramid, urn or cave, statue or Lares figure. That this may be the favored location and secret resting place of the soul that, although not cast out of space, is disencharged to placeless roaming without the embedding love of the one still protected by corporality. If, For example, a warrior fell in battle at a distance, or someone suffered a shipwreck at sea, so his relatives erected a cenotaph on land, an empty grave, the protected site where the image of the dead person was petitioned to return. The fabric of Eros is spun with an unterrible strength between the images of prehistory and the dispositions of those in the present. All rites and customs of the dead, symbols and soul legends unanimously point to a fact that was ethnically widespread in the Pelasgian age, and which a later period primarily achieved through rites. Ecstatic epoptia. It was a drama that compelled participation, better to command an inward participation, that shifted the Eleusinian mysties temporarily into a state of corporeally independent visions. And from this state he carried with him the experience of the reality of images and the presence of the departed, and with that the now unshatterable certainty of the relentlessly renewing soul of life. While the mysteries attempted to convey a visionary thinking that transcended rational science within a humanity that had already degenerated due to the capricious rule of the spirit and a reasoned sense of utility, so those mysteries themselves were doomed to death, that is, to relentlessly increasing rationalization. Ultimately, they would have been contradictory to their origins, even if they had not had to burn previously in the fire of Christian hate, the essence of which we shall cover below. For the time being, we shall complete our overall portrayal of the nature of visions by adding yet something from the traditions of customs and rites to the essences gained from interpreting ancestor veneration. The original sacrificial meal is not merely a meal to honor the god, but rather a sacrifice of the god himself with a subsequent ingestion by the participant, but in the sense of mating with him. At this point, we will not offer general evidence of this, as it will suffice for the present purpose if one were to concede only those cases that were present as examples. Assuming this to be the case, the corporeal process of cultic eating would without exception bear the character of a symbolic act, even if it occurred through consumption of a sacrificial animal, or even in the form of cannibalism, which it is no longer debated originally had religious significance everywhere. This is in fact true. Just because it does not mean the body that is to be consumed but its image, the emulating shape serves just as well when made from dough, which in many places led to the name, the god that one eats. The ancient forms of the German Pfefferkuchenreiter, gingerbread horsemen, and Spitzmützenmanner, pointed hatmen, were originally figures of deities conceived in terms of folk tradition. Today they are still eaten in Catholic countries at such festivals that were previously associated with sacrificial meals. They are also brought to friends' homes to eat, so that they may partake in the grace received through pilgrimage. However, before we contemplate the gamos nature of eating, we shall tackle a widespread fallacy. Genuine symbols are never metaphors, and eating cake in the likeness of the deity, for example, is absolutely not conceived as a mere similitude. If in the case of primal consciousness, the soul of the thing lay in the image of the thing, then embracing or eating the likeness of it served to unite with it. The Zwinglian expression of the Eucharist that merely represents the wine as the divine blood is rationally spurious. The wine is blood, by virtue of mystical vision, as far as it gives an observable likeness of blood. Ancient writers repeatedly call wine the blood of the earth. The nearly indisputably presiding view in ethnology today, that we originally sacrificed animals or people in the flesh, but later due to an awakened humanity, took preference to lifeless substitutes, is for a start in contradiction to not a few events of precisely the opposite nature, which we will however not go into at this point. On the other hand, this view is incapable of explaining why the replacements were not made using, for example, the familiar offertory, but were instead facilitated by visually similar after images. Was a debt ever viewed as paid because the debtor made a gesture of payment? Or was purchased fruit ever considered actually delivered due to someone making the gesture of giving? And if in fact that never happened, should we then not refrain from speaking of a substitution or replacement, and rather ask the question of why such gestures arose, unmistakably based on a principle, for the act of sacrifice amongst all peoples? As the Roman rule of sacrifice clearly says, Siendam in sacris simulata proveris accipi. Namely, one must know that when it comes to sacrifices, the merely simulated is held to be true. How would such a principle have ever come into being were not reality for the consciousness of the visionary a reality of appearance and phenomenon? For this reason, we see that the menoidaimosio could not of the frenzied celebrations of all people and all times are transformed into daimons through disguise and masks. This form of symbolic expression does not indicate a subsequent weakening of the primeval tradition. Instead, quite the contrary. It speaks of its deepest significance. In all cult activities, it is never a matter of the material, but the soul of the material, which reveals itself solely in the image. But one might object in any case, saying that precisely the custom of eating a deity indicates the absolutely material foundation of the main perception. Even so, it remains conspicuous that in place of the real deity, his likeness in dough, or even in just a piece of bread, is viewed as sufficient to partake by this means in his soul. Thus, empowerment is through the process of eating, that is, through ingestion and incorporation of the body, that is held to be divine. In response, we would say that the concept of matter appears in different lights depending on whether we view it to be the basis for the objects perceived or the fulcrum and abode of the images. And there is a vast difference between ingestion from a drive to melt with the image of the food and ingestion from a drive to feed. Matter as a basis of the perceptual world is only a conceptual thing that serves the mathematical mastery of movements. Matter as the abode of images, on the other hand, indicates, as the word matter itself conveys, the dark hemisphere of reality, without which the expanse of phenomena would not even be conceivable. As stated above, there is, however, no drive for nourishment, but merely hunger and thirst on an animal level, or Aristotelian, irresistible drives for union, sometimes with something solid, sometimes with something liquid, and these drives can only be suitably determined by offsetting against images. Hunger and satiation presuppose two things: the dependence of the animal body on the world in general, and an interrelationship between the animal and a species-specific facet of the world. The impression of the hunger-slaken world facet affects the bearer of life in a stimulating and enticing way. The animal unifies itself with the world facet through the process of eating, which is signified by physical sense of well-being. That the images are chosen especially through the nose, tongue, and touch organs, far less than through the eye, should not prevent us from taking into account of the visionary aspect in respect of the mediating sensory processes. A being equipped simply with a sentient sensuality would merely experience varying impressions. He would as such stand in the world as if in the middle of immovable but never penetrable prison walls, and he would not in the least experience the reality of images. Let us consider the potential futility of believing that qualities are touchable, for then we know that there is a visionary aspect in tasting, smelling, and touching, which is why in itself it does not abort the ecstatic birth of images when it occurs through savoring and eating. If there is undoubtedly a peculiarity in the connection between the animal's sensory capacity and edible substances, where each species seeks for the sustenance befitting it, then that particularity must be based on the polaric tension between the soul of the animal and the image of the matter. This then bridges the gap to the initially highlighted fact that every higher developed individual expresses selective inclinations in eating and drinking, the fulfillment of which is connected to a more soulful elation than the mere slaking of hunger might provide. If the preponderance of visionary capacity now differentiates primal man from animals, and the selective inclination grows in him, meanwhile far beyond his simple needs, then even eating might ultimately appear to us in the light of a marriage of the soul and a procreant force. Replace the purposeful idea of taking in sustenance with the experience of the ecstasy of savoring, and we find ourselves on the way to perceiving eating as an aspect of a manifestation of Eros. The person who follows this through to the end will know of a way of eating that is experienced as a polaric connection of the eater with the eaten, and which occurs with rapturous shivers. However, in such a case, it is not just an edible substance would be consumed, but rather its image with the aid of that substance. Its soul is consumed, its essence united with one's own body's soul, and the act of eating is accompanied simply by an ecstatic surrender of the eater to the eaten. And so we enjoy, says Novalis, the genius of nature every day, and each meal becomes a meal of remembrance, a mystical means to deification. Is that corroborated by cult traditions? We only need to place a few well-known ancient texts from Eleusinian, Orphic, Egyptian sources, and associated rites alongside each other to immediately recognize that traditions symbolizing marriage and mystical eating run synonymously and with equal meaning through epoptic ceremonies. We shall consider the following first. From the Sabos mysteries, we know the dia tu corpu theos, through the god's bosom, which is the ritual act of pulling a golden snake through the bosom of the initiate. Bishop Asterius says of the Eleusinians, "Is that not the sinister descent and celebratory conjoining of the hierophant and the priestess between him and her alone? Are not the torches extinguished, and do not an innumerable number place their salvation in what happens in the darkness between the two?" According to other reports by Christian critics, the hierophant declares, "A holy youth, Brimos, was born to the illustrious Brimo, the strong bearing the strong." De Jong points out that the 9-day mystery rite of a secret society of Hopi Indians in Arizona is similarly ended with the subterranean marriage between the snake hero and the snake virgin. According to Clemens, the Kabiri hid the phallus in the holy chest, that the soul is the receptive part, and at the same time the deity is the procreant part that can be seen. For example, in the statement of evidence by the holy Mystes on one of the golden tablets, "I went beneath the womb of the chthonic goddess." Since such acts and symbols leave us in no doubt about the marriageable nature of visions, so the following shows us the same experience regarding the symbol of eating. Firmicus Maternus bears witness to the Attis cult with the sacred formula, "I have eaten of tympanums, drunk from cymbalons. I have borne the Cernos, vessel with the first harvest of the fields. I have learned the secrets. I have entered the bridal chamber, and I have become a Mystes of Attis." Porphyry, in his writings on abstinence, quotes from a long-last work of Euripides with words directed from the chorus to Minos. "I lead a holy life. I became a Mystes of Zeus, of Ida, and a herdsman of the knightly Zagreus. And after I held aloft the torch for the mountain mother Rhea and finished the meal of raw flesh, I became a Curetes, a Bacchus." The so-called Eleusinian formula is, "I have fasted, I have drunk the kykeon, I have taken from the chest, and after I did this, I placed him back in the basket and returned it to the chest." The god in the chest is in this case the snake. Furthermore, I, the billy goat, have given milk. The meaning of drinking from the crater, an essential initiatory act of most mystery rites, is evident for the Eleusinians in particular from the fact of their passing into cult legend. Demeter mourning and Eleusis refuses any sustenance, finally made to laugh by a slave girl's joke. She drinks the kykeon made from barley grass, water, and mint. Likewise, the initiatory stages in the cult of Mithras are plainly separated according to foods, which the Mystes, as we might now well say, embraces at each level. On the 4th level, the stage of the lioness, he receives honey for the first time. On the 5th, that of Perseus, he is fed with milk and honey. Drink the milk and eat the honey before the sun rises, then you will behold the god. Such evidence, while unquestionably appropriate to show mystical eating and drinking in the light of a marriage, nevertheless does not let us guess at the internal shivering through which it would be what it pretends to be, a conception of the god with the subsequent birth of an image. In order to be certain of this, we turn from priestly to orgiastic rites. The theme is repeated in diverse ways in Orphic poetry about the gods. A primordial god torn to pieces by a tragic event is distributed across the world in order to finally resurrect from infinite dismemberment. Thus we hear of the dispersal of the primal being, Phanes. Zeus acquired a leftover part of the remains and created Dionysus Zagreus in snake form with Persephone. And again it was said of him that as a child he was outwitted by the Titans. They gave him a mirror so that he would sink into the sight of himself. Then they attacked him, upon which he transformed himself into a lion, a dragon, and finally a bull, which they tore apart and consumed. The lightning bolt of Zeus burned them to ashes. The human race that arose from this is therefore part Dionysian and part Titan in origin. The heart of the child is, however, saved by Athena. Zeus absorbed it into himself and created with Semele the new Dionysus. Scholasticism tends to prefer to single out from such obviously artificially collated legends those parts deemed to have an unmistakably theological intention, in which mislead through convoluted ways to those always intellectual pantheisms, which were the first to encourage rational thinking in its battles to annihilate the world of senses, and which thus caused the unique occurrence of Greek philosophy. Besides, the motifs used are incomparably more revealing for the prehistoric soul constitution, namely the aforementioned magic of transformation, but also self-reflection, which we meet in the legend of Narcissus, and which was also a custom of the Corbiantism, and also the much discussed mystery concept of rebirth, and finally the tearing apart of a daemonic being, immediately reminiscent of the legends of Orpheus or Osiris and other similar beings, including being repeatedly devoured in two ways. They and only they refer back to the experienced realities. The act of orgiastically tearing apart a deity does underlie the tearing apart and devouring as attested to in the illustrative portrayals in prosaic reports for the entire ambit of frenzied cult festivals. We know from Greek Bacchus celebrations, and we find it portrayed on beautiful ancient reliefs, that maenads entwined with snakes tear apart rams. The community of Cretan Dionysus Mystes use their teeth to tear apart and devour a still bloody actual bull. They then ran amok and carried away the heart in a chest. The holy Nilus tells us of the Bedouin tribes who, between the rise of the morning star and sunrise, rip apart a camel in an orgiastic frenzy and demolish it still bloody. The tearing apart of at least one limb is apparently still observed today on high holy days in Algeria. The sacrificial animal was an image of the god himself for the ecstatically entranced man, a fact that can certainly be discerned from the theogony that was referred to, even if it is not evident from the original myths, and in particular from the further fact that, as we now know, always male god, in the form of precisely those images, marries himself to the female as a symbol of the surrendered human soul. Bacchus, in the shape of a bull, strides before Pentheus, who has been transformed into a maenad. By the call of the trumpet, the woman of Elis calls the god from the ways with the crow's feet. Axi taure, worthy is the bull. Pasiphae uses the artifice of Daedalus to join with Poseidon's cow, and gives birth to the Minotaur. Zeus escapes Europa as a bull. When the beam of the two-gendered moon falls on a cow in heat, the Apis bull, that is Apis himself, is born to the Egyptians. The ancient Mexican sacrificial traditions ultimately manifest the chief principle of the entire matter with glaring clarity, precisely because of their gruesome aberration of coarse violence and grotesque extremity. It is well known that for the greatest sacrificial festival of the Aztecs, the person is often chosen for sacrifice a whole year beforehand. The closer the time of his demise, the greater the honors that were bestowed upon him, until finally he was worshipped as that very deity for whom his sacrifice was intended. The participants of a likewise orgiastic sacrificial meal were also god devourers, and even their eating is the expression of a god soul entering into the mysties who themselves have become God through the same process. The daimon appears to the man in the grip of ecstasy in symbolic form of a ram, a bull, a snake, a hybrid creature from perhaps a human and a bull, or also in human form. And the violent tearing apart and devouring is just the most liberated way of him melting with the daimon. By absorbing the daimon into himself, he simultaneously surrenders himself to the daimon. He then proceeds, pregnant with the god. He is entheos, filled or possessed by the god. He is himself a bull or ram, has become one with the soul of the all, the soul that is ever renewing from death's darkness in glowing images of abundant fullness. On the part of the mysties, the devouring means acceptance of the god or conception. On the part of the daimon, it means his pouring out into the soul of the mysties, the tearing apart of Dionysus Zagreus by the Titans of Orphic mythology, and subsequent rebirth distributed over two mythological events, what represents two pulses of the mysties experience. God eating as receiving a god is followed by the birth of the ensouled and ensouling image. Let us consider this verse by Goethe. Into all regions of the world disperse, away from this holy feasting. Rush impassioned through nearby localities, into the all and teem therein. We were therefore right when we presented the drive to devour as being amongst the love drives in the first chapter. Our oblique look at orgies, however, now appears to elicit a counter-question. If the neophyte to this union admittedly appears to lack that liberating shudder during the sober-seeming act of drinking from the crater, breaking bread and such like, from which he alone would stand as in aeternum renatus, then indeed conversely the ecstatic tearing apart, whether of man or even only beast, gives the impression of excess and of terrifying wildness. As such, we automatically ask ourselves if such acts of destruction must yield an experience, the culminating significance of which we have recognized to be the beholding of vision of the reality of images. Could not a completely elemental man receive the rite of union through the usual eating and drinking within the ecstasy of a celebration? The answer is, it certainly does not have to be the case. The intensity of expressions accompanies only one type of ecstasy, and not necessarily self-surrender per se. In fact, whenever self-surrender occurs, with dreadful convolutions, it must be fighting with an obstacle, and can only take place once that has been removed. In this we are, by the way, touching on a fundamental issue. It began with the first of such frenzies. Ever since bloody sacrifices, but also secret societies and rites existed. In regards to the shredding of soul and body, already incipient during the prehistorical times, the accumulation of bloody sacrifices signifies the pressure of resistance against the soul, and the ever more distinctly cathartic approach signifies the resistance directed against the body. As strange as it might sound, ancient Mexican cannibalism and rituals to Moloch involving roasting of children on the one hand, Orphism striving towards Platonism on the other hand, are merely differently directed expressions of the same division of the poles. The one unbloody, Promethean, false track leads to desensualized reason-based beliefs in the reality of conceptual content. The other, bloody, Herculean path leads to the prioritization of purpose before reason, and following macabre slaughter will end with complete atomization. How then has the religion of will that is Christianity far surpassed Aztec cannibalism in the number of human sacrifices made? Following on from the Greek legend of the all-consuming flood, we have named the primal humanity according to the mythical names of those exterminated in the flood, namely the Pelasgians, and among the Deucalian people we have traced exclusively those traits through which they are connected to primal man. But now a few words about the most important traits in which even the preparatory period of history and the culture of antiquity deviate from genuine Pelasgianism, or rather about their emanation into different directions from one single point of radiation. In doing so, we touch on Eleusis. According to the general opinion of classical studies, our explanations regarding these traits that have given us the example of the Eleusinians would be absolutely incorrect, for it was not a matter of what we have called the eternity of life nor immortality, but instead of an ensuring a blessed life after death. The hymn to Demeter says, "Blessed is he who has seen this of earth-born men, but he who has not partaken in those deeds, those holy ones, an unequal lot is he apportioned in the darkness surrounding death." Immortality is therefore already presupposed, and the focus is merely on the form of a continued existence. An Eleusinian grave inscription from the 2nd Christian century even proclaims, "Truly, a beautiful mystery is proclaimed by the blessed gods. For mortals, death is no curse, but a blessing." In response, we could say that whenever and to whatever degree the concept of immortality has gained ground, there is without fail an equally passionate desire by people for a pleasant immortality. And whenever a sacred covenant takes account of the hopes for immortality by its participants, it inevitably promises future blissfulness. In other words, blissfulness is self-evident as soon as the appeal of the mysteries is constituted in a future life. Yet furthermore, a certitude of bliss was conveyed by awakening the visionary capacity. On the other hand, blissfulness was projected into a future life through that misleading of intellects, which we have yet to qualify very briefly. Let us consider for a few moments the following contrasts, and the fact that they negate each other will be palpable. Desire for immortality and for making life eternal. Ministering to the dead preserves a being that has in fact already existed. Belief in immortality promises something that does not in any shape or form exist. The former entrusts itself to the past. The latter is alienated even from the present and has degenerated entirely with bygone things and sacrifices the unique, existent, eternal, the life emblazoned moment, to a future that is merely perceived conceptually. The former, sprung from love of the physically alive to the dark bright images of life, places its protagonists into a restlessly transfiguring circle of necessity. With the latter, individuals uprooted by selfish hubris flee from the terror of the unavoidable end into the doctrinal lie of the trans-temporal continuation of a separate existence. In summary and clearly put, the mentality of the cults of the dead asks, what has become of those who were, and how do we improve their lot? Whereas a believer in immortality asks, what will become of me when I no longer exist, and how can I procure a happy, continued existence? A belief in immortality thus proceeds from selfishness, and that means it has put the I in place of the soul, and consequently the will to exist in place of life. The will to exist is a hostility to images and focuses on disembodiment. For all must fall into nothingness, if it in being strives to last. The more the will to exist is embedded, the more the meaning of ecstatic experience changes until it ultimately dies. From renunciation of the self comes renunciation of life. From union with the all, through breaking object barriers, come escape from the all by shattering the bodily prison. And so from out of this internal break, Orphism fled to the aesthetic delusion of the body as the grave of the soul. This delusion alone, as is self-evident, was spun by a philosophy betrayed by the spirit to form those enormous systems whose utterly self-contradictory structure one could accurately compare to the hopeless beginnings of a great architect, who may indeed have designed the most ingenious plans, but who unfortunately determined never to use any earthly material for his structures. However, this is not the place to talk of such things. The matter here is of the suppression of the body. Let us consider the following in order to understand the complementary suppression of the soul. There is no bridge leading from the entity-filled spring of the past into the entity-empty nothingness of the future. However, turning towards the future coincides with turning away from the past, and whoever has become one full of hope, he has equally become one full of fear. If a man hopes to gain access to heaven after his death, so he also fears hell. Retaining his eye in hope as in fear, he has turned away from the ever-flowing primal source that only lends him life. Note the turn of phrase, to lend life. And so, the motherly Eumenides changes for him into the vengeful Erinyes, the souls of the dead, no longer fed by a sense of self-tempered by love, become bloodthirsty vampires that one attempts to appease in vain with hecatombs of animals and people. The very heart of the present for each person who succumbs to the fallacy of a belief in the future is fear. Fear of death, fear of tomorrow, fear in itself because fear of the next minute, fear arising from wantonly missing out on life, which, even when all belief in spirits is long dead, just continues to grow, ever more consuming as a bad conscience. And such I was before I fell to searching the dark with curses world and self-besmirching. So thick is now the air with spook and elf that no one knows how to extract himself. Though smiling day with light of reason gleams, the night entangles us in webs of dreams. We gaily turn from meadows lush with sap. A bird will croak. What does it croak, mishap? Enmeshed on every hand by superstition, events of omen, portent, premonition. Abashed we stand, alone with but our fear. The counterpiece to heavenly blissfulness is hell on earth. And the worst form of such hell on earth is restlessly slumber-deprived wakefulness of that eternally unsatisfied wanting and its self-anesthetization through service to Mammon. How these revelations are applied to the details of the aforementioned, and in particular to the differing natures of historical humanity, must be left to the reader. We would not have anything further to add if we were not justified in being concerned that there is still a doubt to be raised which has probably been felt from the start of reading this chapter. Indeed, to what degree, you must ask, is the prehistoric ministering to the souls not the expression of a belief in immortality? Even though the Pelasgian man may not have seen the soul in things but in images, nevertheless, his customs surrounding the care of grave sites show that he invoked a continuation for that which he considered to be the soul beyond the sensual body of the man. We would ask you to give especial attention to our reasons against the validity of this view, because they may serve more than all the explanations to show in the clearest light possible our doctrine of the reality of images. In the first place, it is apparent that if images are something unceasingly flowing, then existential reasoning applies to it only metaphorically. Images equal metamorphoses, but metamorphoses do not equal existences. The reality of images, the most real, or rather the only one that there is an eternal coming and going, growing and fading, illuminating and extinguishing. In contrast to the time-divested rigidity of the object being, this reality is not conceived by using concepts, but symbols, of which we have got to know several. Things and persons exist. However, images and they alone live, and the reality of being alive is fundamentally different in nature from the conceivability of existing. Secondly, the recipient of the existent thing is the mind, conceiving it, which is suited to all beings capable of thought, and which completes the same deeds with arbitrary repetition. The recipient of images is an independently alive soul whose derationalized visions never fully repeat in the same way. The world of images thus only awakens in the visionary eros of the one experiencing those images. The so-called continued existence, which is in fact the living present that the Pelasgian sought for the souls of his dead, springs forth from moment to moment out of the elemental erotic associations, connections between those who have existed and those alive in body. The image soul dies when it dies in the souls of those who revere and recall it. This is where the deepest root lies of that otherwise incomprehensible thing, the care of souls, the ancient custom of adoption that is still practiced today amongst primitive peoples as well as amongst the Chinese and Hindus, stood and stands in the service of the ancestor cult, with the purpose of leaving behind descendants who will bring due sacrifice to their own manes. Finally, from that we draw our third point, namely that the transformations of the soul are essentially interdependent on the transformations of their cult. The ancestor and guardian spirit of the house gains strength from the abundance and depth of living adoration that is paid to him by its physically living inhabitants. Yet he emaciates and disappears when forgotten by them. Once humanity in its entirety has lost the gift of visions, so the last stragglers will unerringly hear the harrowing cry of woe. The great Pan is dead. Let us look back and summarize. In the ecstatic flush of arousal, life aims at liberation from the spirit. This is achieved by awakening the soul. And the awakening of the soul is in the visionary capacity. The soul sees the reality of the primal images. Primal images are manifesting souls of the past. In order to manifest, they require a connection with the blood of those physically alive. This occurs during the visionary event, which is thus a mystical marriage between the surrendered receiving soul of the visionary and the procreant daimon. Once come to, or woken up, the ecstatic knows when his consciousness is capable of reflecting differently, that the world of facts is merely a hard-to-break figment of fantasy, that the world of bodies is a world of symbols. At the very least, however, the spawns of visions inseminated by the primal world in the light of which withering away and dying mean transformation. One probably recognizes now why no other philosophy was able to entice and tempt the rapturous men and poets to such a degree as Plato's theory of forms. Arising from Orphic theology, it appears to offer its innermost sense and meaning in the language of a higher consciousness. It is also according to this that the lover is blessed with reminiscing visions, yes, even in union with the beloved, equally, and by that very fact he regains the eternal life of the original divinity. And here too we boast with the language of metaphor, in terms of inner procreation and birth. However, the one sentence, namely that is the thing that is seen, that colorless and intangible and immaterial substance, which in truth has existence, reveals to the one who understands that in this instance the timelessly enduring illusory world of reified concepts has been falsely attributed to the reality of constantly momentary images, and in accordance with that illusory world, pre-existing visions evaporate into a dialectical act of reason.